Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In this video, I will be going through a few different types of qalams that we generally use for calligraphy, how to prepare your own ink pot, and also how to cut your own qalam. So first, the most popular one that everyone tends to be familiar with is the typical bamboo pen. Now, bamboo in nature is very hard and very firm, so when it comes to cutting your qalam, it can prove to be very difficult, especially if you've never done it before. Then we have these, which are known as jali qalams. These aren't exactly cut from a piece of wood, rather they're sort of fixed together, and the wood at the top is also a very hard piece of wood, so it's not easily broken. The lines through the wood, they're used as reservoirs to hold the ink, and these qalams are generally used for larger pieces of compositions, not for jali thuluth or jali diwani. That's why they're called jali qalams, or cheli in Turkish. The most popular one to use, especially for beginning stages, is the reed, or handam as some people call it. The reed is very similar to bamboo, but it's a lot softer generally, which makes it a lot easier to cut and a lot easier to use as well. So when you're practicing cutting a qalam, this type of wood is probably the best to use. Okay, so here we have one piece of wood. It hasn't been cut yet, so it's still pure reed wood. Now, the knife that we use to cut it, generally we'd use a blade that has a curve at the end. We wouldn't use a knife with a straight sharp edge. For example, this type of knife. As we can see, the edge that it's used to cut is very straight. This would make it harder to actually cut a qalam. So these are the knives we would not generally use. You'd ideally want to look for a sharp blade that has a nice curve to it, and traditionally the blade or the knife that calligraphers would use would be in a similar style. Although this larger knife I'm only showing you as a visual example, because as you can see, this knife is very flimsy, so when it comes to cutting a pen, it's not very handy. The best that I've come across is this, a scalpel knife, Swan make. The good thing about these is they have one blade that is the perfect angle that you need to cut the qalam, this curve that we have. And secondly, another good thing about this knife is when the blade does get blunt, all you have to do is take the blade off and put a new one on, so there's no hassle of sharpening your blade over and over again. Okay, now ideally when you start cutting your qalam, first thing you want to keep in mind is the finished cut that you want at the tip of your qalam should sit comfortably on your thumb. So this is the type of curve that you'd want. So when you start cutting, it's good to measure. First, pick a side that you'd want to cut the qalam. Measure about half the tip of your thumb, because the end will be cut off. So from about here, you hold your pen like this, let the pen rest under your thumb, and then you just go slow, step by step. It's good to just take it in layers rather than go deep straight away, because sometimes you can lose control like that. Holding in this position and cutting it gives real stability when you're cutting your knife, when you're cutting your pen, sorry. But when you try this at home, it might be ideal to use to wear a glove just in case. These blades do tend to be really sharp, so it's best to be extra careful. Okay, so now we've got this much, we've got a good amount. You can measure it with your thumb. It's good to keep it smooth, that way when you're using it to write, it feels very balanced. Okay, so once you've cut this much off, can you see this? You've got a very thin amount here, and it can get very weak at the top. So then we just cut the sides for the desired tip of the nib that you want. Usually we do keep it at between 3 to 4 millimeters long, and you want it to look equal from both sides. So you want that nice sort of curve coming in from all sides. Then when you cut the tip of the nib, you want to cut it at an angle. So here is an example. Especially for Thuluth, ideally you want an angle that's about 55 to 60 degrees approximately. So if the baseline was from the lower part and you drew a straight line, then the angle going up would be about 30 degrees, 30 to 35 degrees. Now this is just a general figure that you usually use to guide when you're cutting your column, to give you a good understanding. Although after you've started writing a few times and you've been practicing, the angle can slightly change a few degrees based on what you're comfortable with. So not everyone has the exact same angle on their column, so it's not something that you have to measure when you cut. It's more of a trial and improvement. What you end up feeling comfortable with, that's the sort of angle that you'd use, keeping in mind that the proportions and the strokes and everything are all in line, which is why generally a calligrapher or someone who has their own calligraphy pens or columns would not give it to someone else to use, and you shouldn't. When you make it, when you've got an angle that you're comfortable with, it should only be used just for yourself. Okay, now with some bamboo pens and even some reed, you can just snip a tip a bit off from the top just to make it flat from both sides. Okay, so this side and the bottom, we have a flatness on either side, and the last thing that you do is cut the angle. So you'd always leave that till the end because you want that sharp finish to your pen. Okay, so to cut the end, again, you'd just, this is where the curved edge comes in handy. All you do is place, and then you can just roll it backward and forward instead of having to press down. And here you have a nicely shaped column ready to be written with. Now I won't be using this to write because I cut it in the angle for a right-handed person. So a person who's right-handed, that when you cut your column, if you look at your column from this angle, then the right side would be higher and the left side would be lower. Okay, when you look at it from this angle. Whereas for me, if you look, the left side is higher and the right side is lower, so it's easier for me to write. Now, an interesting point here is when you do cut your qalam, do not throw the pieces away. If you can, keep an extra pot. Like I have a small jar here, and whenever you cut your qalam or whenever you recut it, always put the shavings, store it away. This traditionally what the Ottomans would do, and I think still do, the calligraphers in Turkey, is when they cut the qalam, they collect all the shavings, and over time as they build up, all the calligraphers, they gather all the shavings together, and when there's enough, what they do is they'd burn the wood and they'd use the fire to heat up water, and this water was used to clean a dead body that's ready to be buried. So there's a whole spiritual link here from even the remains, the part that you do not use from your qalam. Okay. Once your qalam is ready, you'll be using it to write calligraphy. You'll be writing Quran ayats, ahadith, letter after letter after letter, and the parts that you've cut away from it, that also is going to use. So there's this very strong spiritual link in the whole tradition of calligraphy. One thing I forgot to mention, I was planning to mention at the beginning, is the length of your qalam. So ideally, when you first start, the initial length of your qalam should be from the tip of your middle finger up to your wrist line. That is the normal length for a qalam. You don't want anything shorter, and obviously after you've cut it a few times, they can go a bit short. Like this one has been cut a couple of times, and you don't want anything short. Once you've cut it a few times, you don't want to shorten it anymore. Okay. Now, generally, cutting your qalam is not something that you would get first time. It's something that takes practice and you do over and over again. Okay. Now here is a very cute little qalam. This is the one I practiced cutting my pen with, and now I just keep it just to show and as a keepsake item. I don't use it because obviously it's really short. It's very difficult to write with, but I keep it just as a memory and just to show people. This was this long. Okay, it was the same height the same length when I started, but I kept cutting it until I came to a point when I was happy. So when you cut it, the few things that you want to look at is, first, when you're looking at it straight on, both sides should be equal. So the nib should be positioned in the center. This curve should be a smooth curve rather than something that's jagged. And this, like I mentioned before, you'd measure the inner curve with your thumb. If it sits comfortably inside, then you've got a very good cut. Okay. Now, with some pens, you would add a slit in the middle. So for the slit, all you do is place your knife about here in the center and you just press in and you'll get your slit. Now this slit also helps as a small reservoir when you're writing, holds a bit of the ink, which allows a bit more flow. But for beginners and for early stages, the slit is not recommended because it makes the tip of your qalam a lot more fragile. So a person who hasn't used bamboo or reed before and who tries to use it, they would naturally press harder with the qalam. Now this is a mistake, but it's something that we learn from. Okay. Now if we did have a slit in the middle, the moment you press too hard, this end would just snap off, which is why the slit is not recommended at the beginning. But practicing cutting a pen is very nice. It's very therapeutic, and it's an achievement that you can feel you've made once you've sort of mastered your own qalam or cutting your own qalam. These are things we look at before we even think about writing or putting pen to paper. Jazakallah khair. Hope you enjoyed the video and you learned a lot. If you do have any questions, please feel free to get in touch. Our email is info@houseofcalligraphy.co.uk, and whatever questions you have in mind, do get in touch with us and we'll help as much as we can, inshallah. Jazakallahu khair. Assalamu alaikum.